Grazie di
What if one man could hold an entire nation hostage? What if he could rewrite history with fear, erase enemies overnight, and turn a paradise into a nightmare? Well, deep in the heart of Africa, where the Nile whispers secrets and the jungle swallows the past, a man rose from the shadows. His name whispered in fear. A soldier turned tyrant, a leader turned butcher. Yet to some, he was a hero, to others a monster. Was he a product of colonial ambition, a dictator drunk on power, or something even more terrifying, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature? This is the story of Idi Amin, the dictator the world tried to forget. But should we? In the remote village of Koboko, where Uganda, Sudan, and the Congo blur into a landscape of hardship and survival, a boy named Idi Amin Dada was born, likely around 1925, though no official records exist. Some accounts suggest he was born even later, perhaps in 1928. He belonged to the Kakwa, a small but resilient ethnic group with deep ties to Nubian mercenaries who had served in colonial armies for generations. His heritage placed him on the fringes of Ugandan society, neither fully accepted by the dominant ethnic groups nor completely an outsider. Amin's childhood was shaped by absence. His father, a soldier turned farmer, abandoned the family early, leaving his mother Asa Ate to raise him alone. More than just a herbalist, she was rumored to have spiritual and political influence, traits that may have inspired Amin's later belief in mysticism and his ability to wield fear as power. Growing up in poverty, he learned early that survival was not guaranteed. It had to be fought for. Formal education was a luxury beyond his reach. He briefly attended an Islamic school in Bombo, but his schooling likely ended around 3rd or 4th grade. This lack of formal schooling shaped his later distrust of intellectuals and preference for action over ideology. By his teens, Amin had dropped out and taken to the streets, selling mandazi, laboring on plantations and relying on his size and wits to carve out a living. He was over 6 feet tall before adulthood, a natural athlete who excelled in swimming, boxing, and rugby. In 1946, the British colonial army offered an escape. The King's African Rifles had a recruitment strategy, targeting so-called martial races like the Kakwa and Nubians, men they believed were naturally suited for combat. Amin fit their ideal perfectly: tall, strong, fearless. He enlisted and quickly gained a reputation for his brute strength and unwavering loyalty. His British officers saw him as the perfect enforcer, effective, obedient, and intimidating. They called him the Big Drum. His presence was impossible to ignore, yet few truly understood him. But Amin wasn't just a blunt instrument. He watched and learned. While British officers sipped tea in Nairobi clubs, he was out in the field doing their dirty work. He played a key role in suppressing the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where his reputation for violence began. Under British command, he participated in brutal interrogations and executions, enforcing colonial rule with an iron fist. The ruthlessness he displayed during these operations shaped his approach to power. Violence was not just a tool, but a language. Despite his limited education, Amin had a sharp instinct for survival. The British assumed he was a loyal soldier, but in reality he was studying their methods, how they controlled people, how they divided societies, and how they held power. He also learned to switch allegiances when necessary, a skill that would later define his political career. By 1959, he was one of only 2 Ugandan soldiers promoted to Effendi, a rank that placed him between the British officers and African troops. The colonial establishment thought they had trained a dependable enforcer. What they didn't realize was that Amin was learning how to replace them. Behind his wide grin and booming laugh, he stockpiled grudges. The British mocked his broken English, but overlooked his intelligence. They rewarded his service, but ignored his whispered conversations about stolen land and generations of humiliation. His resentment toward the colonial system that controlled Uganda grew in silence, hidden beneath the charisma and brute force that made him invaluable to his superiors. By the time Uganda gained independence in 1962, Amin had turned colonial hypocrisy into a weapon, one he would soon use against everyone, including those who once commanded him. Amin wasn't born a monster. He was shaped by empire, then turned the blade on those who forged it. Uganda's independence in 1962 shimmered with hope, a nation breaking free from colonial rule. But beneath the euphoria, a dangerous power struggle was already unfolding. Prime Minister Milton Obote, a fiery socialist with grand visions, and Idi Amin, his fiercely loyal but unpredictable military enforcer, forged an uneasy alliance. Together, they would dismantle democracy and ultimately destroy each other. The conflict between Milton Obote and the Kabaka, king of Buganda, Mutesa II, was deeply rooted in Uganda's colonial history. Buganda, the most powerful kingdom in Uganda, had historically enjoyed special privileges under British rule. However, after independence, tensions grew between Obote's central government and the Buganda monarchy, which sought to maintain political and territorial autonomy. By the mid-1960s, this friction reached a boiling point. The Buganda Lukiko Parliament openly defied Obote, demanding that the central government vacate Buganda land. This was a direct challenge to Obote's authority, coming at a time when he was already facing internal threats, including accusations that he had personally embezzled gold and ivory smuggled from the Congo. These allegations also implicated Idi Amin, whose involvement in the illicit trade made him financially independent. Faced with mounting opposition, Obote took drastic action. He suspended the constitution, declared himself president, and ordered a military crackdown on the Buganda monarchy. This led to one of the most defining events in Uganda's post-colonial history, the storming of the Kabaka's palace. Idi Amin was not just a participant, he led the attack. On May 24, 1966, under direct orders from Obote, Amin commanded government forces to storm Lubiri, the Kabaka's palace in Kampala. The battle was fierce, but the king's guards were no match for Amin's firepower. Hundreds died, and the Kabaka barely escaped into exile in London. Amin's brutality was already notorious, but this act cemented his reputation. Soldiers under his command executed prisoners, looted the palace, and destroyed royal artifacts. Some reports suggested that treasures from the palace made their way into Amin's personal possession, further enriching him. For Amin, the attack was a defining moment, one that secured his promotion to army commander. But it also marked the beginning of his break with Obote. Obote had relied on Amin for brute force, but the unchecked violence of the Lubiri attack alarmed him. While Obote wanted to crush the Buganda monarchy, he also sought to avoid completely alienating the Buganda people. Amin, however, had shown no restraint. His indiscriminate killing and looting created more enemies than Obote had anticipated. Even within the military, Amin's excessive violence was raising concerns. Intelligence reports surfaced of gruesome executions carried out on Amin's orders. Rumors circulated that he kept severed heads of enemies in his barracks as trophies. Senior commanders viewed him as dangerously unpredictable, a soldier who seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. By 1969, Obote had grown wary of Amin. Reports indicated that Amin was building his own power base, recruiting soldiers personally loyal to him and expanding his illegal gold and ivory smuggling networks. Amin was becoming financially independent from the government, operating outside Obote's control. This made him a potential threat. Obote moved to cut Amin's access to funds and limit his authority. But by then, it was too late. Amin had already learned the art of switching allegiances, a skill that would soon define his rise to power. By 1970, Amin had begun laying the groundwork for his takeover. He forged key alliances, secured foreign support, and misled Obote's government into underestimating the threat he posed. He knew that Obote was losing allies. His socialist policies, crackdown on political opposition and control over the economy, had alienated much of the political elite and business class. Many officers, particularly from ethnic groups sidelined by Obote, saw Amin as a strongman who could restore their influence. He recruited these disgruntled soldiers, promising them better positions under his command. At the same time, Amin was winning favor with foreign powers. Israel saw Amin as a key ally in East Africa. The Israelis had trained his paratroopers and hoped to use Uganda as a strategic counterbalance to Arab nations. Amin had spent time in Israel's military training camps, and Tel Aviv viewed him as a useful pro-Western figure in a volatile region. Britain also saw Amin as pro-Western and easy to influence. Unlike Obote, who was leaning towards socialism and nationalisation, Amin reassured London that British businesses in Uganda would remain protected. Diplomatic signals suggested that Britain would not intervene if Amin seized power. Gaddafi's influence came later. At first, Amin wasn't deeply ideological. His main concern was securing power. But when Western support began to wane, he turned to Libya and the Soviet Union for weapons, money, and political backing. Meanwhile, Amin was feeding Obote's intelligence network false information. He planted loyalists within Uganda's security services, ensuring that reports downplayed his movements and alliances. Obote, already distracted by political infighting, failed to recognize the growing threat. By the time Obote realized the extent of Amin's scheming, it was already too late. One of Amin's most brilliant deceptions was his ability to make people underestimate him. From the beginning, he crafted an image of himself as a simple, jovial man of the people. He staged elaborate rallies, handing out money and food to crowds, playing the role of a generous, charismatic leader. He joked with foreign dignitaries, often making absurd, outlandish statements that seemed too ridiculous to take seriously. He used humor to deflect criticism, appearing as a bumbling strongman rather than a ruthless dictator in waiting. Even Britain and Israel, who had backed him initially, failed to grasp the full extent of his ambitions. By the time the world realized that Amin's antics masked deeply violent and paranoid mind, he had consolidated absolute power. By January 1971, Obote, sensing betrayal, plotted to arrest Amin during a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, but Amin struck first. On January 25th, as Obote's plane soared over the Indian Ocean, tanks rolled into Kampala. Radio Uganda crackled with a lie that would echo through history. The army has taken control to restore democracy. Amin's coup was a masterclass in deception. He posed as a liberator, promising to restore democracy, end corruption, and heal tribal divisions. Even Britain and Israel, wary of Obote's socialist ties, welcomed him as a pro-Western reformer.
I will well and truly exercise the functions of the head of government of the Republic of Uganda, so help me God.
But within days, the mask slipped. Amin had fooled the world, but Uganda was about to discover the real Idi Amin.
members of the Uganda Army and Air Force decided to take over from the civilian role because of the last arrangement which were made by the Dr. Apollo Milton Obote to disarm the all tribe of Uganda except his own tribe Langi and Acholi. And also that is the point which brought all this problem.
Idi Amin's Uganda was a carnival of terror, a land where the whims of a dictator became law and paranoia seeped into the soil. By 1972, Amin's regime had mutated into a grotesque theatre, a mix of tribal vendettas, economic suicide, and a megalomania so vast it defied reason. Uganda had become a land of whispers. Fear hung in the air like a thick mist, pressing down on the people. Civilians shuffled through the streets with downcast eyes, avoiding the gaze of Amin's soldiers, who prowled the roads, armed and unpredictable. Military roadblocks littered the highways, where soldiers could arrest, rob, or kill with impunity. Ministers in Amin's cabinet lived in silent terror, forced to enroll as military cadets, knowing that any attempt to resign would be considered desertion. Even within his own government, words had to be measured, movements calculated. Disobedience meant death. Amin's brutality extended far beyond politics. His regime became a machine of slaughter. The first to suffer were the soldiers from the Acholi and Langi ethnic groups, men Amin saw as loyal to his predecessor, Milton Obote. The initial purges were swift. Thousands of Acholi and Langi officers were rounded up, executed, and buried in shallow graves. Prisons became killing fields. At Mutakula, near the Tanzanian border, prisoners were not shot, but hacked to death with bayonets and hammers to avoid alerting Tanzanian forces with gunfire. At Makindye prison, the mass executions became so routine that prisoners had to climb over the bodies of their murdered comrades, only to be gunned down at the gates. Fear paralyzed Uganda. Resistance, even in thought, was an act of suicide. But Amin's thirst for blood was insatiable. His violence reached beyond the military, seeping into every corner of Ugandan society. The Chief Justice, Benedicto Kiwanuka, was arrested and never seen again. Journalists, intellectuals, and students who dared to question the regime vanished overnight. The Catholic editor, Father Clement Kigundu, was strangled, shot, and then set on fire. Prominent businessmen were dragged from their homes, their cars later seen driven by Amin's intelligence officers. Even foreigners were not safe. 2 Americans, journalist Nick Stroh and university lecturer Robert Seidel, were murdered and their bodies incinerated to erase all trace of them. Amin's paranoia infected his inner circle. The very men who had helped him rise to power became his victims. His intelligence chief, his most trusted officers, even his legal advisors, were either imprisoned or executed. As his grip on Uganda tightened, he saw enemies everywhere. He expelled the Israelis despite their crucial role in training his army. He alienated Britain while still claiming to admire the Queen. He accused Tanzania of plotting against him, Rwanda of harboring spies, and Kenya of conspiring with Western powers. His speeches became more erratic, his threats more unhinged. Meanwhile, Uganda's economy collapsed. The 1972 expulsion of Uganda's Asian community, 80,000 people given 90 days to flee, plunged the country into economic freefall. Overnight, businesses shut down, factories stalled, and the markets emptied. Amin boasted that the expulsion was an economic war to reclaim Uganda's wealth for Africans, but in truth, it was looting at a national scale. The businesses and properties left behind by the Asians were handed over to Amin's military officers and political allies, men who had no knowledge of running businesses. The result was chaos.
And Abdul, since you like food so much, you can have that grocery there and eat everything.
Thank you, General.
Who was that shop?
I do.
It is yours. Kibedi, I think I'll give this one to my wife. She likes textile.
By the end of Amin's first year, government borrowing from the central bank had exploded from 150 million to nearly 1,000 million shillings. Inflation spiraled out of control. Basic goods, salt, sugar, even soap, became scarce. The black market flourished, and soldiers hoarded supplies, selling them at extortionate prices to starving civilians. Yet Amin's military elite lived in obscene luxury. Army captains moved into grand homes, drove expensive cars, and kept multiple wives while ordinary Ugandans struggled to afford a meal. Soldiers flaunted their stolen wealth, but their arrogance concealed deep divisions. The army was now filled with illiterate, over-promoted officers, many of whom avoided the company of educated officers out of shame. Those who dared to question the corruption were branded traitors and disappeared. The killings never stopped. Every crisis, every setback was met with more blood. In 1977, Archbishop Janani Luwum dared to criticize the regime's brutality. Days later, Amin's men dragged him away, claiming he had died in a car accident. But when his bullet-riddled body was found, the truth was clear. The same fate befell countless others. Judges, diplomats, students, anyone who showed defiance was hunted down. Even Amin's allies saw his madness. Ministers spoke in hushed tones of his outbursts, his obsession with revenge, his erratic orders. Some speculated that he held personal grudges against Asians because of a failed marriage proposal to a wealthy widow in the Madhvani family. Others whispered about his love for brutality, how he bragged about eating human flesh, how he saw fear as the greatest weapon of all. Amin's international standing crumbled. His insults toward African leaders, his threats to invade neighboring countries, and his praise of Hitler left him isolated. Only Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and Saudi Arabia offered him financial support, seeing an opportunity to push Uganda toward Islamization. Amin, ever the opportunist, embraced their aid. He vowed to crush Israel in a week and South Africa in 2 weeks, boasting that Uganda's soldiers would march across the continent in a show of African strength. Yet beneath the bravado, Uganda was unraveling. The streets of Kampala became ghostly, businesses shut down, petrol stations ran dry, and once busy hotels stood desolate. Foreign embassies reported that entire families had vanished overnight, their homes looted by soldiers. Diplomats and professionals fled the country in waves, knowing that their survival depended on escape. Amin's madness reached its global climax in 1976, when Palestinian hijackers diverted an Air France flight to Entebbe. Amin welcomed the terrorists as comrades, hosting them in the old airport barracks. For a week, the world watched. Then came the Israeli raid, lightning-fast, surgical and humiliating. The hostages were rescued, Amin's soldiers lay dead, and Uganda's dictator was left raging in the ruins of his airfield. His response? A parade. He declared victory, claiming that he had survived an Israeli attack, proof that he was untouchable. Yet even in the shadow of terror, resistance smoldered. Underground networks smuggled dissidents out of the country. Ugandan exiles in Tanzania plotted his downfall. Some brave citizens, risking death, fed information to the outside world about Amin's atrocities, and in the villages people learned to survive. They spoke in whispers. They avoided eye contact with soldiers. They hid their sons when recruitment trucks passed through. Life became a game of silence, caution, and endurance. By 1977, Uganda was a necropolis. Schools became torture centers. Hospitals ran out of drugs, but overflowed with political prisoners. Yet Amin, ever the showman, hosted lavish parties, serenading guests with his accordion, while his henchmen dumped bodies into crocodile-infested lakes. The world watched, half horrified, half fascinated, as if his reign were a macabre spectacle. But outside Uganda's borders, forces were gathering. Amin's delusions of invincibility would soon be shattered. His time was running out. By 1978, Idi Amin's Uganda was a tinderbox, economy in ruins, streets stained with blood, and the tyrant's paranoia metastasizing. Desperate to resurrect his fading power, Amin lit a match. For years, his relationship with Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere had been hostile. Nyerere had condemned Amin's coup in 1971, offering refuge to exiled Ugandans, including Milton Obote and Yoweri Museveni, who were organizing resistance. Amin saw Tanzania as an enemy state, a haven for traitors. But in late 1978, his internal problems boiled over into a full-blown war. Amin's own military was fracturing. Brigadier Mustafa Adrisi, his vice president and one of his closest allies, had fallen out of favor. When Adrisi was severely injured in a mysterious car accident, an event widely believed to be an assassination attempt ordered by Amin, tensions within the army exploded. Factions turned against each other, and discipline collapsed. In this chaos, a group of Amin's troops crossed into Tanzania's Kagera region on November 1, 1978. Some believe it was an unplanned provocation by undisciplined soldiers. Others suspect Amin ordered it to rally his fractured forces against a common enemy. Regardless, the Ugandan military looted villages, killed civilians, and claimed Kagera as Ugandan land. Amin saw an opportunity to project strength. He formally declared that Uganda had annexed Kagera, claiming it was historically Ugandan territory. His propaganda machine roared to life, broadcasting triumphalist speeches about reclaiming Africa from imperialist borders. But this was not 1972. The world was no longer watching in amused horror. Ugandans were exhausted by war, and even Amin's allies began to doubt him. Nyerere did not hesitate. On November 2, 1978, Tanzania declared war. This was not just retaliation, it was an opportunity. With Amin's military weakened from internal purges and desertions, Nyerere saw a chance to remove him permanently. He mobilized 45,000 troops and partnered with the Uganda National Liberation Army, UNLA, a coalition of exiled Ugandans who had spent years waiting for vengeance. Their rallying cry? Free Uganda from the butcher. The war turned quickly. By January 1979, Tanzanian forces armed with Soviet tanks and Cuban-trained pilots decimated Amin's demoralized army. Ugandan exiles, led by future President Yoweri Museveni, launched relentless guerrilla raids, cutting supply lines and sowing chaos. As Amin's forces retreated, they did not go quietly. They looted entire villages, raped civilians, and executed suspected traitors before fleeing. In Masaka and Mbarara, towns that had once flourished, his soldiers massacred civilians and burned entire neighborhoods to the ground. The blood of innocent Ugandans soaked the land as Amin's men took their final revenge. Amin's grip on reality unraveled. He claimed divine intervention, even as his remaining generals defected. In his palace, he issued orders to ghost armies, convinced that reinforcements were coming. But by April 10, 1979, the truth was undeniable. Kampala had fallen. Amin's reign ended as it began, with a midnight escape. On April 11th, he fled Kampala in a convoy of Mercedes-Benzes, clutching stolen gold and a Quran. His first sanctuary? Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi, ever the provocateur, welcomed him as a brother revolutionary. But even Gaddafi grew tired of him. Amin, once a useful ally, had become an embarrassment. His unpredictable nature, his outbursts, his grandiose demands, Libya could no longer afford his chaos. When Gaddafi's patience ran dry, Amin was forced to seek refuge elsewhere. Saudi Arabia agreed to take him, but with conditions. He was granted asylum on the condition that he remain politically silent. No speeches, no interviews, no more talk of reclaiming Uganda. The Saudis saw him not as a brother, but as a relic, something to be locked away, never to be used again. In exile, Amin lived as a parody of himself, a war criminal turned suburban dad. He fathered 43 children, hosted barbecue parties, and granted bizarre interviews, boasting of his friendship with the Saudi royal family. But beneath the surface, he never accepted defeat. He spent years dreaming of a return to power, sending messages to old allies, clinging to the fantasy that Uganda would call him back. His supporters dwindled, his letters went unanswered, and his name became a ghost in Ugandan politics. Meanwhile, Uganda burned. Bodies piled up in the streets as rival factions clashed for power. Milton Obote, restored to the presidency, ruled with an iron fist, unleashing his own brutal purges. Yoweri Museveni, a young guerrilla commander, watched as Uganda's chaos deepened, preparing for his own rise. Amin's legacy was far from over. Amin never faced justice. When he died in 2003, a diabetic kidney failure shell, he was buried quietly in Jeddah. No extradition, no trial. Just a tombstone paid for by the Saudi king, inscribed with the title he craved most, President Idi Amin Dada. His legacy? A nation forever altered, a generation orphaned, and a haunting question. When tyranny falls, who answers for the dead? Uganda survived Idi Amin, but survival is not healing. The scars of his reign, shattered institutions, tribal fractures, and a generation raised in terror linger like phantom limbs. Amin's legacy is a paradox, a cautionary tale writ large in blood, yet reduced by some to a caricature of madness. Amin's economic policies set Uganda back decades. Inflation hit 1,000%, roads crumbled, hospitals became morgues. Yet Amin's impact was not just economic or psychological, it reshaped Uganda's entire political landscape. His downfall did not bring peace. Milton Obote, restored to power in 1980, unleashed his own reign of terror, sending his forces to massacre thousands in the Luwero Triangle. The National Resistance Army, led by Yoweri Museveni, waged a brutal guerrilla war before seizing power in 1986. Today, Museveni remains in office, his rule marked by accusations of repression, corruption, and constitutional manipulation. Uganda did not break the cycle of dictatorship, it merely changed its face. The Last King of Scotland won Forrest Whitaker an Oscar, but its Hollywood sheen risks reducing genocide to a villain's origin story. Amin himself reportedly loved the film, proof that even monsters crave immortality. His story has been told and retold, often with a focus on his absurdities, his outlandish titles, his boastful threats, his larger-than-life persona. But beneath the theatrics lay something far more insidious. Amin wasn't an anomaly, he was colonialism's Frankenstein. The British groomed his brutality, then recoiled when he turned it on them. His reign forces us to confront an ugly truth. Tyranny isn't born. It's built. And it wasn't just Britain. Israel trained his elite forces, Libya funded him, and Saudi Arabia gave him refuge. The world propped him up when it was convenient, then discarded him when he became uncontrollable. The foreign powers that armed him and the diplomats who shook his hand have never answered for their complicity. Yet Uganda's real reckoning isn't with Amin's ghost, it's with his living enablers. The soldiers who never faced trial, the foreign governments that justified his atrocities, the global silence that let the slaughter continue. Today, Uganda rebuilds. Skyscrapers pierce the sky where torture chambers once stood. Amin's old State Research Bureau headquarters is now a shopping mall. His villas, once filled with terrified prisoners, have become luxury homes. But ghosts don't vanish so easily. They linger in mass graves unmarked, in families fractured, in the quiet grief of those who survived. Amin is gone, but the forces that created him, the tribal divisions, the militarization of politics, the international hypocrisy remain. Uganda moves forward, but history is not buried. It waits. The lesson isn't just never forget, it's never again.
succeed, yeah.